Have you ever wondered what happens when a single act of compassion collides with the most dangerous ideology in human history? When choosing to save a life could cost you everything you hold dear? When love blooms in the shadows of occupation, defying every rule, every boundary, every expectation that war has carved into stone? Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary and forbidden encounters from World War II. A story that will challenge everything you think you know about humanity during our darkest hour. This isn't just another war story. This is a testament to the power of individual conscience to rise above the machinery of hatred, even when that choice could mean death. Picture this. It's October 1942, and Prague sits under the iron fist of Nazi occupation. The cobblestone streets that once echoed with laughter and music now tremble under the boots of the SS. Every citizen understands the rules. Every person knows their place. The lines between friend and enemy have been drawn in blood, and crossing them means certain destruction. But what happens when a Czech nurse, sworn to heal the wounded, finds herself face to face with an SS officer whose life hangs by a thread? What happens when duty collides with humanity? When the Hippocratic Oath meets the machinery of genocide? When one woman's choice to see a human being instead of a uniform changes everything? This is the story of Katarina Novakova, a dedicated nurse working in Prague's underground resistance medical network, and Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Richter, an SS officer whose world would be shattered by a single moment of mercy. Their paths should never have crossed. Their hearts should never have connected. Yet in the chaos of occupation, the most impossible connections often prove to be the most profound. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might realize. This isn't just a romance that happened to unfold during wartime. This is proof that even in humanity's bleakest moments, individual choices can transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and hatred try to create between us. It's evidence that love doesn't recognize the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve, but sees straight to the soul beneath. I've spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from archived letters, resistance records, and testimonies that survived the purges. What I discovered will shake you to your core because this story isn't unique. Across occupied Europe, countless individuals made impossible choices, choosing humanity over ideology, compassion over compliance, love over the machinery of war. But Katarina and Wilhelm's story is different. Their encounter was documented in ways that most forbidden wartime relationships never were, preserved in a collection of letters and diary entries that remained hidden for over 70 years. These documents reveal not just what happened between them, but how love can become the most dangerous act of rebellion imaginable. Prague in October 1942 was a city holding its breath. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich 4 months earlier had triggered brutal reprisals that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. The SS had responded to the resistance attack with systematic terror, executing thousands of civilians and reducing the village of Lidis to ash and memory. Fear hung over the city like smoke, thick and suffocating, turning neighbors into potential informants and making every conversation a calculated risk. Katarina Novakova was 26 years old, with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. She had been working as a nurse at Prague's General Hospital since before the occupation, but the war had transformed her role in ways she never could have imagined. By day, she tended to patients under the watchful eyes of German administrators. By night, she moved through Prague's shadows, providing medical care to resistance fighters who couldn't risk seeking help through official channels. The underground medical network that Katarina served was a lifeline for the Czech resistance. Safe houses scattered throughout the city provided treatment for wounded fighters, while a carefully constructed web of sympathetic doctors and nurses ensured that medical supplies disappeared from hospital inventories without raising suspicion. Every bandage diverted to the resistance, every dose of morphine smuggled to a safe house, Every moment spent treating illegal patients was an act of treason punishable by death. Katarina had joined this network not from political ideology, but from a simple belief that healing transcended politics. She had taken an oath to preserve life, and that oath made no distinction between the uniforms people wore or the causes they served. This principle would soon be tested in ways she never anticipated. Wilhelm Richter presented a very different face to occupied Prague. At 28, he wore the black uniform of the SS with the rigid bearing of someone who had been trained to embody absolute authority. His rank of Hauptsturmführer marked him as a rising star in the Nazi hierarchy, someone whose career prospects seemed limitless in a Reich that promised to last 1,000 years. But beneath the uniform lived a man struggling with contradictions that would have been dangerous to voice aloud. Wilhelm had joined the SS not from fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology, but from family pressure and the practical calculation that refusal would destroy his future in a Germany where political conformity was mandatory. His father, a decorated veteran of the Great War, had made it clear that military service was the path to respectability and success. Wilhelm's assignment to Prague had initially seemed like a privilege, a posting that would allow him to demonstrate administrative competence while avoiding the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. He served in the office that managed civilian labor assignments, processing paperwork that determined which Czech workers would be sent to German factories and which families would be separated by the demands of war production. The work was bureaucratic rather than violent, but Wilhelm was not naive about its consequences. Every signature he provided, every document he approved, every order he transmitted was part of a system designed to drain the life from occupied territories. He told himself that someone would fill his position regardless, that his presence might even moderate some of the harsher policies, but these justifications felt increasingly hollow as months turned to years. The contradiction between Wilhelm's public role and private conscience created a tension that manifested in sleepless nights and a growing reliance on alcohol to numb thoughts he couldn't afford to think. He found himself noticing details that should have been invisible to someone in his position. The fear in civilian eyes when SS officers passed, the way children hurried to cross streets when they saw his uniform, the gradual disappearance of familiar faces from neighborhoods that had once bustled with life. These observations accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone, slowly eroding the certainties that had allowed him to function within the system he served. Wilhelm began to understand that he was not just a cog in an administrative machine, but a participant in something that violated every moral principle he had absorbed during his childhood in a family that attended church every Sunday and taught him to treat others with basic decency. The crisis that would bring Katarina and Wilhelm together began on a cold morning in late October, when resistance fighters attempted to sabotage a rail line carrying military supplies to the Eastern Front. The operation was planned meticulously, designed to cause maximum disruption while minimizing casualties among Czech railway workers who had no choice but to collaborate with the occupation. But intelligence had been compromised, and SS units were waiting when the saboteurs approached their target. The ensuing firefight left 3 resistance members dead and 2 others wounded, including their explosives expert, a young man named Pavel whose knowledge of German defensive positions made him invaluable to future operations. Pavel managed to escape the initial ambush, but a bullet had shattered his shoulder, and blood loss was making him delirious. His comrades faced an impossible choice. Taking him to a hospital meant certain capture and execution. Attempting to treat his wounds in a safe house without proper medical equipment would likely result in his death from infection or shock. The decision to contact Katarina came from desperation rather than careful planning. Her reputation within the resistance network was built on successful treatment of injuries that should have been fatal, performed in basements and attics with improvised tools and stolen supplies. If anyone could save Pavel's life under impossible circumstances, it would be her. The message reached Katarina during her evening shift at the hospital, passed through a chain of contacts that included a janitor, a kitchen worker, and finally a sympathetic doctor who understood the stakes involved. The request was simple but terrifying. Come immediately to a safe house in the old town. Bring whatever medical supplies she could acquire without raising suspicion, and be prepared to perform surgery under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced physicians. Katarina's response reveals the kind of courage that defined the Czech resistance during its darkest hours. Without hesitation, she began gathering supplies, using her legitimate access to hospital resources to assemble a surgical kit that could save Pavel's life. Morphine disappeared from locked cabinets. Surgical instruments found their way into her medical bag. Antibiotics that were desperately needed for German patients were redirected to a cause that could cost her everything. The safe house was located in a medieval building near Prague Castle, its thick stone walls providing both concealment and symbolic irony. Here, in the shadow of the seat of Czech power that had been transformed into the center of Nazi administration, the resistance continued its work of preserving Czech independence through small acts of defiance that accumulated into something larger than their individual parts. Pavel's condition was worse than Katarina had expected. The bullet had not only shattered bone, but had also damaged arteries that were bleeding internally, creating complications that would have challenged surgeons working in fully equipped operating theaters. Working by candlelight with instruments that had been sterilized over an open flame, Katarina began the delicate process of saving a life that the SS would have gladly ended. Hours passed as she worked, her hands moving with the precision that comes from years of training, combined with the desperate focus that emerges when failure means death. Pavel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in pain despite the morphine, sometimes mumbling intelligence about German positions that could be crucial for future operations. It was during one of these delirious episodes that disaster struck. Pavel, in his pain-induced confusion, began shouting in German, repeating phrases he had overheard during reconnaissance missions. His voice carried through the building's thin walls, reaching the street where SS patrols conducted their nightly rounds with increasing frequency since the recent sabotage attempt. The patrol that heard Pavel's cries included Wilhelm Richter, who had been assigned to night duty as punishment for what his commanding officer considered insufficient enthusiasm for his administrative responsibilities. Wilhelm's superiors had noticed his growing distraction and decided that exposure to the realities of occupation duty might restore his focus and commitment to the cause. What happened next would change 3 lives forever and challenge everything both Katarina and Wilhelm thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and the choices that define who we truly are when tested by impossible circumstances. Wilhelm approached the building where Pavel's cries had originated with the mechanical precision that military training had drilled into him. His fellow officers moved with eager anticipation, sensing the possibility of uncovering resistance activity that could earn them commendations and advancement. For them, this was an opportunity to demonstrate their value to the Reich through decisive action against Czech insurgents. But Wilhelm felt only dread as they climbed the narrow stairs of the medieval building. Each step carried him closer to a confrontation that would force him to choose between the uniform he wore and the conscience he had been struggling to silence for months. The voices from above grew clearer as they ascended, revealing not the coordinated activity of a resistance cell, but the desperate sounds of someone in terrible pain. When Wilhelm kicked open the door to the safe house, he expected to find armed fighters preparing for battle or perhaps a communications center coordinating attacks against German positions. Instead, he discovered something that stopped him cold. A young woman in a blood-stained dress knelt beside a makeshift operating table, her hands deep inside the chest cavity of a man who was clearly dying despite her desperate efforts to save him. Katarina looked up at the SS officers filling her doorway and felt time slow to a crawl. She had always known this moment might come, had rehearsed in her mind what she would do if discovered during a medical operation for the resistance. But faced with the reality of black uniforms and drawn weapons, all her preparation seemed inadequate against the crushing weight of certain death. The other officers began shouting orders in German, demanding that she step away from the patient and place her hands where they could see them. Their voices carried the harsh authority of men accustomed to immediate obedience, the kind of compliance that occupation had trained Czech civilians to provide without question or hesitation. But Wilhelm found himself studying the scene with different eyes. He saw not a criminal caught in an act of treason, but a medical professional attempting to preserve life under impossible circumstances. The surgical instruments arranged on a cloth beside the operating table told a story of careful preparation and professional competence. The way Katarina's hands moved with practiced precision, despite the terror in her eyes, spoke of years of training and dedication to healing. Most importantly, Wilhelm recognized something in Katarina's expression that he had been seeing in his own mirror for months. The look of someone trying to maintain their humanity while the world around them descended into madness. The exhaustion of fighting to preserve moral principles in a system designed to destroy them. The quiet desperation of someone who understood the cost of their choices but could not bring themselves to make different ones. In that moment of recognition, Wilhelm made a decision that would alter the trajectory of 3 lives forever. Instead of following protocol that demanded immediate arrest and interrogation, he stepped forward and spoke in Czech, his voice carrying an authority that silenced his fellow officers. He told them that the situation required careful handling, that evidence needed to be preserved, that rushing the arrest might compromise intelligence-gathering opportunities. His words were calculated to buy time while he processed what he was seeing and decided what action his conscience could tolerate. Wilhelm's colleagues accepted his assessment because his rank demanded their deference, but also because his explanation aligned with their training about the value of intelligence over immediate gratification. They stepped back, allowing him to take control of a situation that had suddenly become more complex than a simple arrest. Katarina watched this exchange with growing confusion. She could not understand why the SS officer was speaking her language with surprising fluency, or why he seemed more interested in studying her surgical technique than in dragging her away for interrogation. The contradiction between what she expected and what was happening created a surreal quality that made the entire scene feel like a fever dream. Wilhelm approached the operating table slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening despite the weapon at his side. When he spoke to Katarina, his voice carried none of the harsh authority she had learned to expect from German officers. Instead, he asked about Pavel's condition with what sounded almost like professional interest. The question revealed knowledge of medical procedures that seemed impossible for someone whose role involved administrative paperwork rather than battlefield medicine. Katarina found herself responding instinctively, explaining the complications she was facing and the challenges of performing surgery without proper equipment or sterile conditions. For several minutes, they discussed Pavel's injuries as if they were colleagues consulting on a difficult case, rather than enemies separated by uniforms and ideology. Wilhelm's questions demonstrated understanding of anatomy and surgical procedures that suggested either medical training or extensive experience with battlefield injuries. This impossible conversation was interrupted by Pavel himself, who regained consciousness long enough to see SS uniforms surrounding his operating table. His reaction was immediate and violent, thrashing against Katarina's restraining hands while crying out warnings in Czech about German positions and patrol patterns. Wilhelm's fellow officers perked up at these revelations, recognizing intelligence value that could advance their careers and demonstrate their effectiveness to superiors who measured success in captured resistance members and extracted information. They began pressing for immediate interrogation, eager to exploit Pavel's delirious state before medical treatment could restore his ability to resist questioning. But Wilhelm surprised everyone, including himself, by declaring that the patient was too unstable for interrogation, that medical treatment must be completed before any questioning could yield reliable intelligence. He ordered his men to secure the building while he supervised the completion of the surgical procedure. The justification was militarily sound, but Wilhelm knew his real motivation had nothing to do with intelligence gathering, and everything to do with an unwillingness to watch someone die when intervention was possible. The contradiction between his official duties and personal conscience had reached a breaking point that demanded action, regardless of consequences. Katarina resumed her work with trembling hands, acutely aware that every movement was being observed by men who could end her life without consequences or hesitation. Yet she found herself drawing strength from Wilhelm's unexpected support, his presence somehow transforming the situation from hopeless to merely desperate. As she worked, Wilhelm positioned himself between Katarina and his fellow officers, using his authority to create space for her to complete the surgery, while maintaining the fiction that everything was proceeding according to proper protocol. His body language communicated protection without making that protection explicit or official. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by Wilhelm's quiet translations when his men grew impatient with the pace of medical treatment. He explained procedures and timelines with the confidence of someone who understood both medicine and military necessity, buying precious time for Katarina to complete work that was saving Pavel's life, one careful suture at a time. When dawn broke over Prague's ancient spires, Pavel's condition had stabilized enough that Katarina could step back from the operating table with cautious optimism. The surgery had been successful, but infection remained a constant threat without proper antibiotics or sterile recovery conditions. Wilhelm's next decision would determine whether this night represented a temporary reprieve or the beginning of something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, duty, and the price of maintaining one's humanity in an inhuman world. The dawn light filtering through the grimy windows of the safe house illuminated a scene that defied every rule of occupation. An SS officer standing guard, while a Czech nurse completed surgery on a resistance fighter. Three people whose roles should have made them mortal enemies, now bound together by circumstances that none of them could have imagined just hours before. Wilhelm watched Katarina clean her instruments with the methodical precision of someone whose training had become second nature. Her hands moved steadily despite the exhaustion that lined her face, despite the knowledge that discovery meant certain death for everyone in this room. There was something about her composure under impossible pressure that reminded him of the doctors he had known during his brief medical studies before the war redirected his life toward administration and uniforms he had never wanted to wear. His fellow officers were growing restless. Sergeant Mueller kept glancing at his watch, calculating how long they had been away from their assigned patrol route. Corporal Beck shifted his weight from foot to foot, eager for action that would justify the night's unusual activities to their commanding officer. They trusted Wilhelm's judgment because military hierarchy demanded it, but their patience was wearing thin as morning approached without arrests or intelligence breakthroughs to show for their efforts. Wilhelm knew he was running out of time to maintain the fiction that this was all proceeding according to proper protocol. Soon, his men would expect him to make decisions that aligned with their training and expectations. Pavel would need to be transported for interrogation. Katarina would need to be arrested as a resistance collaborator. The safe house would need to be searched for evidence that could lead to other arrests. But as he watched Katarina check Pavel's pulse one final time, Wilhelm found himself calculating different possibilities. What if Pavel died during transport, eliminating the intelligence value that justified keeping him alive? What if the nurse's medical expertise proved essential for maintaining the patient's condition during questioning? What if this entire situation required more careful handling than standard procedures could provide? Katarina finished her work and stepped back from the makeshift operating table, her surgical gown stained with blood that told the story of a night's desperate labor. Pavel's breathing was steady now, his color improved, his vital signs stabilized through skill and determination that had overcome impossible odds. She had saved a life that should have been lost, performed a miracle with tools that belonged in a museum rather than an operating theater. When she finally looked at Wilhelm, her eyes held questions that she dared not voice aloud. Why had he allowed her to complete the surgery? Why had he protected her from his fellow officers' impatience? Why had he spoken to her with courtesy rather than the brutal authority she had learned to expect from SS personnel? Wilhelm met her gaze and felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than the circumstances that had brought them together. He saw in Katarina's face the same struggle he had been fighting for months, the exhaustion of trying to maintain moral principles in a world that punished decency, the weight of choices that seemed impossible but could not be avoided, the quiet desperation of someone who understood the cost of their actions but could not bring themselves to choose differently. The moment was broken by Sergeant Mueller's voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. He wanted to know what procedures they would follow for transporting the prisoners, what arrangements needed to be made for securing evidence, what timeline they should report to their commanding officer for the night's activities. Wilhelm's response came without conscious thought, flowing from instincts he didn't fully understand. He declared that the situation required special handling due to the medical complications involved. The patient was too unstable for standard transport procedures. The nurse's cooperation would be essential for maintaining his condition during any movement. Intelligence gathering would be compromised if either prisoner died before proper interrogation could be conducted. His explanation was militarily sound, but Wilhelm knew he was buying time while his conscience wrestled with choices that would define the rest of his life. Every additional hour of delay increased the risk that his superiors would begin asking questions he couldn't answer. Every moment of protection he provided to Katarina and Pavel deepened his own complicity in activities that could cost him everything. Katarina understood enough German to follow the general direction of the conversation, even if specific details remained unclear. She watched Wilhelm's face as he spoke, noting the tension around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone operating under enormous pressure. There was something about his manner that suggested this was not routine for him, that the decisions he was making represented departures from standard procedures rather than practiced efficiency. The way his fellow officers deferred to his authority, while clearly questioning his judgment, told its own story about relationships and expectations within the SS hierarchy. Pavel stirred on the operating table, consciousness returning in fragments that brought awareness of pain, confusion about his location, and growing terror as memory reconstructed the events that had brought him to this place. His eyes found Katarina's face first, drawing comfort from familiar features in an unfamiliar environment, then moved to take in the SS uniforms that surrounded him. His reaction was immediate and visceral, the instinctive response of someone whose survival had depended on avoiding exactly this kind of encounter. Pavel tried to sit up despite his injuries, tried to speak despite the morphine that made coherent thought difficult, tried to prepare for interrogation that would surely follow discovery by German authorities. Wilhelm watched this awakening with growing unease, understanding that Pavel's consciousness would complicate an already impossible situation. The resistance fighters' presence made it harder to maintain the fiction that medical necessity justified their current arrangements. His knowledge of German positions and Czech operations made him valuable in ways that would attract attention from intelligence officers who specialized in extracting information through methods Wilhelm preferred not to contemplate. Katarina moved quickly to calm Pavel, speaking in rapid Czech that Wilhelm's language training allowed him to follow with reasonable accuracy. She explained that the surgery had been successful, that his condition was stable, that he needed to remain still to avoid reopening internal injuries. Her voice carried professional authority mixed with personal concern, the tone of someone who had invested too much effort in saving a life to watch it be thrown away through unnecessary struggle. But beneath her medical instructions, Wilhelm detected something else in Katarina's words. Coded references that suggested Pavel was not just any resistance fighter, but someone whose knowledge extended far beyond local operations. Someone whose capture would represent a significant intelligence victory for German forces and a devastating blow to Czech resistance activities. This realization created new complications for Wilhelm's already precarious position. If Pavel proved to be a high-value target, his survival would attract attention from SS intelligence specialists who would want to conduct their own interrogations, using methods that made Wilhelm's administrative role seem almost benign by comparison. The protection Wilhelm had been providing would become impossible to maintain once higher authorities learned about the night's events. Yet looking at Pavel's face, still pale from blood loss and surgery, Wilhelm found it difficult to think of him as an intelligence asset rather than a human being whose life had been saved through Katarina's skill and dedication. The young man's obvious pain and confusion triggered protective instincts that Wilhelm had thought were buried under years of military conditioning and ideological pressure. Sergeant Mueller's patience finally reached its breaking point. He approached Wilhelm with barely concealed frustration, demanding concrete decisions about how to proceed with prisoners whose status seemed to shift every hour without resolution. His tone remained respectful due to rank differences, but the underlying message was clear. Standard procedures existed for good reasons, and continued delays would require explanations that might prove difficult to provide. Wilhelm understood that his authority had limits, that his ability to improvise solutions was constrained by military regulations and SS expectations that left little room for individual interpretation. Soon, he would need to choose between following orders that violated his conscience and protecting people whose lives had become unexpectedly important to him. The choice he made in that moment would determine not just the immediate fate of Katarina and Pavel, but the trajectory of his own existence in a world that had become incompatible with the person he was discovering himself to be beneath the uniform he wore with growing reluctance. Wilhelm looked around the safe house one final time, taking in details that would remain with him regardless of what happened next. The medieval stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human struggle, the makeshift operating table where modern medicine had battled against impossible odds, the morning light streaming through windows that had seen empires rise and fall, revolutions succeed and fail, love bloom and die in the eternal cycle of human hope and heartbreak. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of rank combined with something deeper and more personal. He announced that the prisoners would be transferred to a secure medical facility where proper treatment could be provided, while intelligence gathering proceeded according to established protocols. The arrangement would satisfy both medical necessity and military requirements while ensuring that valuable intelligence was not lost due to inadequate care. His explanation satisfied Sergeant Mueller and Corporal Beck because it aligned with their understanding of proper procedures while addressing the complications that had made standard approaches impossible. They began preparing for transport, gathering evidence and organizing logistics for a transfer that would move the operation from improvised safe house to official SS custody. But Katarina heard something in Wilhelm's words that his fellow officers missed entirely. A careful emphasis on certain phrases, a subtle indication that the medical facility he described might not be what it appeared to be, a suggestion that proper care might take precedence over intelligence extraction in ways that could make all the difference for Pavel's survival. The understanding that passed between them was wordless but complete, a recognition that transcended uniforms and ideologies to acknowledge shared humanity in circumstances that should have made such connection impossible. Wilhelm was not just following orders or improvising solutions. He was choosing to protect people whose lives had become precious to him, for reasons he could not fully explain or justify. As they prepared to leave the safe house that had become a sanctuary for impossible choices and unexpected connections, both Katarina and Wilhelm understood that their story was just beginning. The decisions made in candlelight and shadow would follow them into daylight and official scrutiny, creating consequences that would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, courage, and the price of maintaining one's soul in a world determined to destroy it. The transport that followed was unlike anything in SS operational manuals. Wilhelm had requisitioned a medical ambulance from the motor pool, claiming that Pavel's condition required specialized equipment for safe movement. In reality, he was buying time while calculating options that seemed to diminish with every passing hour. Katarina rode in the back of the ambulance, officially designated as medical attendant necessary for patient monitoring during transport. Wilhelm had convinced his superiors that her expertise was essential for preventing complications that could compromise intelligence gathering. The justification was technically sound, but everyone involved understood they were operating in territory that standard procedures had never anticipated. The medical facility Wilhelm had referenced was Prague's German Administrative Hospital, a converted Czech medical college that now served SS personnel and selected civilian cases deemed strategically important. Wilhelm's access to this facility came through his administrative role, but using it to house resistance prisoners would require explanations that grew more complex with each decision. During the ambulance ride through Prague's narrow streets, Wilhelm found himself studying Katarina's face as she monitored Pavel's condition with professional precision. Her movements were economical and confident, the result of years spent managing medical crises where hesitation could mean death. There was something mesmerizing about watching her work, seeing hands that had saved lives move with practiced grace, even under circumstances that would have shattered most people's composure. Pavel drifted between consciousness and morphine-induced sleep, occasionally mumbling phrases that revealed fragments of resistance intelligence. Each revelation made Wilhelm more acutely aware of the value his prisoners represented to SS interrogators who specialized in extracting information through methods that left subjects permanently damaged when they survived at all. The hospital corridors echoed with the efficient bustle of medical staff, attending to wounded German soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved between beds with supplies and medications. Doctors conducted rounds with clipboard efficiency. Administrators processed paperwork that determined resource allocation based on military priority rather than medical need. Wilhelm's arrival with 2 Czech prisoners created immediate complications that tested his ability to improvise explanations for increasingly suspicious colleagues. The duty officer wanted documentation authorizing the use of German medical facilities for enemy prisoners. The head nurse demanded clarification about infection control procedures for patients whose medical histories were unknown. The security supervisor insisted on protocols that would prevent escape attempts while ensuring intelligence value remained intact. Each question required Wilhelm to provide answers that satisfied military bureaucracy while protecting the fiction that everything was proceeding according to established procedures. His responses drew on administrative knowledge accumulated during months of processing civilian labor assignments, but they also revealed creativity he had never needed to access in his previous role as a functionary in the occupation machinery. Katarina was assigned to a private room adjacent to Pavel's medical bay, officially designated as detention pending interrogation, but practically functioning as protected custody that kept her away from SS personnel, whose methods were less subtle than Wilhelm's approach. The arrangement satisfied security requirements while ensuring her medical expertise remained available for Pavel's continued care. The room itself was Spartan but clean, containing a narrow bed, a small table, and a window that overlooked Prague's ancient rooftops. Katarina stood at that window for long minutes, studying familiar landmarks that seemed transformed by her current circumstances into symbols of a life she might never reclaim. Wilhelm visited her that evening, officially conducting preliminary interrogation, but actually trying to understand how his world had shifted so dramatically in the space of a single night. Their conversation began with formal questions about resistance activities and intelligence networks, the kind of routine inquiry that filled SS files with information that rarely proved strategically valuable. But gradually, their exchange evolved into something more personal and immediate. Wilhelm found himself asking about Katarina's medical training, her decision to become a nurse, her experiences treating patients under the desperate conditions that characterized medical care in occupied territories. His questions revealed genuine curiosity about her professional background, rather than intelligence gathering focused on resistance activities. Katarina responded with cautious honesty, describing her education at Charles University, before the occupation transformed academic institutions into tools of German administrative control. She spoke about professors who had inspired her dedication to healing, about clinical rotations that taught her to see past uniforms and ideologies to the human suffering that war created regardless of nationality or political allegiance. Wilhelm listened with attention that surprised them both, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated understanding of medical procedures and hospital administration. His knowledge seemed too detailed for someone whose role involved civilian labor assignments rather than healthcare management, suggesting background or training that his current position did not reflect. When Katarina asked about his apparent familiarity with surgical procedures, Wilhelm hesitated before explaining that he had begun medical studies at the University of Vienna before family pressure and political necessity redirected his career toward administrative service in the SS. His voice carried regret that seemed to go beyond simple career disappointment, touching on deeper questions about paths not taken and choices that had led him far from original aspirations. The revelation created new understanding between them, a recognition that both had abandoned intended careers to serve causes that felt increasingly distant from personal values and professional goals. Wilhelm's medical knowledge explained his behavior during Pavel's surgery, his instinctive understanding of what Katarina was attempting to accomplish under impossible conditions. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Oberfuhrer Heinrich Kessler, Wilhelm's commanding officer and one of Prague's most feared SS administrators. Kessler's reputation was built on efficient brutality that had eliminated resistance cells throughout the Protectorate, making him someone whose attention was universally unwelcome among both German personnel and Czech civilians. Kessler's interest in Wilhelm's prisoners had been triggered by intelligence reports suggesting Pavel's knowledge extended far beyond local resistance activities. Preliminary analysis of his delirious statements during surgery had revealed references to coordinated operations that implied connections between Czech resistance groups and Allied intelligence networks based in London. The interrogation that Kessler proposed would employ specialists whose methods guaranteed information extraction, but rarely left subjects capable of providing additional intelligence in future sessions. Wilhelm understood that Pavel's survival depended on delaying this interrogation, while maintaining the fiction that medical necessity required continued treatment before questioning could proceed. Wilhelm's response demonstrated political sophistication that surprised even him, drawing on bureaucratic knowledge to construct arguments that satisfied Kessler's expectations while protecting Pavel from immediate transfer to specialized interrogation facilities. He emphasized the strategic value of maintaining Pavel's health for extended questioning sessions, the intelligence benefits of allowing medical recovery to restore mental clarity needed for reliable information extraction. Kessler listened with the patience of someone accustomed to subordinates who understood the consequences of disappointing their superiors, but his questions revealed growing suspicion about Wilhelm's unusual interest in prisoner welfare. The balance between medical necessity and intelligence priority was delicate, requiring justifications that could withstand scrutiny from officers whose careers depended on successful information extraction. Katarina waited in her room while these discussions proceeded in German too rapid and technical for her limited understanding of the language. She could hear voices through the walls, recognizing Wilhelm's tone even when specific words remained unclear. There was something about the rhythm of the conversation that suggested negotiation rather than simple reporting, debate rather than routine briefing. When Wilhelm returned to her room hours later, his face carried exhaustion that went beyond the physical demands of a sleepless night. The weight of maintaining multiple deceptions while protecting people whose lives depended on his continued creativity was taking a toll that showed in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile arrangements he had constructed. Their second conversation was more direct than the first, stripped of pretense that neither could maintain after the events they had shared. Wilhelm explained the political pressures that threatened Pavel's survival, the intelligence value that made him attractive to SS specialists, whose methods left no room for medical considerations or humanitarian concerns. Katarina listened with growing understanding that their situation was deteriorating in ways that required desperate measures rather than careful planning. The protection Wilhelm had provided was temporary, dependent on his ability to convince superiors that patients would yield better intelligence than immediate brutal interrogation. But time was running out, and both understood that choices made in the next few hours would determine whether their impossible night together had saved lives or merely delayed inevitable tragedy. Wilhelm's authority had limits that were becoming apparent as higher-ranking officers took interest in prisoners, whose intelligence value seemed to increase with every analysis of their statements and background. The solution that emerged from their discussion was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Wilhelm would arrange for Pavel's medical transfer to a facility outside Prague, officially justified by specialized treatment requirements, but actually designed to remove him from Kessler's immediate reach. Katarina would accompany the transfer as medical attendant, her expertise supposedly essential for managing complications during transport. The plan required forged documentation, manipulated medical records, and coordination with personnel whose loyalty Wilhelm could not guarantee. Every element involved risks that could expose the entire operation, while providing no assurance that success was possible, even if immediate dangers were avoided. Yet both understood that inaction meant watching Pavel disappear into SS interrogation facilities, while Katarina faced charges that would result in execution after her own questioning, revealed the extent of her resistance activities. The choice was between certain death and possible survival, between accepting defeat and fighting for possibilities that seemed almost impossibly remote. As they finalized arrangements that would either save 3 lives or destroy them all, Wilhelm and Katarina found themselves acknowledging feelings that had developed despite circumstances that should have made emotional connection impossible. Their attraction transcended the uniforms they wore and the ideologies they were supposed to represent, reaching something fundamental about human connection that war could not eliminate. The morning would bring new challenges that would test every assumption they had made about loyalty, duty, and the price of maintaining humanity in an inhuman world. But tonight, in a hospital room overlooking Prague's ancient beauty, 2 people who should have been enemies discovered that love could bloom even in the darkest soil that history had ever prepared. The escape plan they had conceived required precision that left no margin for error. Wilhelm's access to military transportation schedules gave him knowledge of medical convoys that regularly moved between Prague and satellite facilities throughout the Protectorate. One such convoy was scheduled to depart the following evening, bound for a rehabilitation center near the German border, where wounded soldiers received extended care before returning to active duty. The facility's remote location and focus on long-term treatment made it ideal for their purposes. Patients there received minimal supervision from SS intelligence personnel, allowing medical staff considerable autonomy in treatment decisions. More importantly, the center's administrator was a career military doctor whose priorities focused on healing rather than ideology, someone who might prove sympathetic to requests justified by medical necessity. Wilhelm spent the day creating documentation that would authorize Pavel's transfer to this facility. The paperwork required careful forgery that balanced official appearance with plausible medical justification. Pavel's condition needed to seem serious enough to warrant specialized care, but stable enough to survive transport without arousing suspicion about the timing of his transfer. The medical records Wilhelm fabricated described complications that were both believable and sufficiently technical to discourage detailed scrutiny from non-medical personnel. Internal bleeding that had been controlled but required monitoring. Neurological symptoms that suggested possible brain trauma needing specialized evaluation. Infection risks that made immediate transfer advisable before conditions deteriorated. Each detail was calculated to support the narrative Wilhelm was constructing, while providing Katarina with legitimate medical concerns that would justify her presence during transport and continued care. The deception required understanding of both military bureaucracy and medical terminology that drew on knowledge Wilhelm had accumulated from his abbreviated studies and recent exposure to hospital procedures. Katarina's role in the plan required her to maintain the fiction that Pavel's condition was more precarious than reality suggested. She needed to appear concerned about complications that were largely imaginary while providing actual medical care that would keep him stable during transport. The performance demanded acting skills that felt foreign to someone whose professional identity was built on honesty and direct communication with patients. The psychological toll of maintaining multiple deceptions was becoming apparent in small ways that both Wilhelm and Katarina tried to ignore. Wilhelm's hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. Katarina found herself startling at unexpected sounds, her nerves stretched thin by constant vigilance. Both were operating on reserves of energy that were rapidly depleting under the sustained pressure of protecting lives that hung by increasingly fragile threads. Pavel's recovery was proceeding more rapidly than the medical records suggested, his natural resilience overcoming the trauma of surgery and blood loss with determination that spoke to the physical conditioning that resistance work demanded. His growing alertness created new complications for their deception, as his questions about their plans and his visible improvement contradicted the official narrative about his condition. Katarina found herself administering sedatives that were medically unnecessary but operationally essential, keeping Pavel in a state that supported their cover story, while ensuring he could not inadvertently compromise their arrangements through statements that revealed his actual condition. The ethical implications of these decisions weighed heavily on her conscience, even as she understood their necessity for everyone's survival. The evening before their scheduled departure brought unexpected complications that threatened to unravel everything they had constructed. Oberfuhrer Kessler announced his intention to conduct a final interrogation session with Pavel before the medical transfer proceeded, claiming that intelligence priorities required immediate attention regardless of medical considerations. Wilhelm's response required diplomatic skill that he had never needed to develop during his administrative career. He could not directly refuse Kessler's demands without raising suspicions about his motives, but he also could not allow Pavel to be questioned in his current state without exposing the deceptions that protected all of them. The compromise Wilhelm negotiated involved postponing the interrogation until after Pavel's arrival at the rehabilitation facility, where improved medical support would theoretically allow for more extensive questioning without risking the prisoner's health. The delay provided time for their escape while satisfying Kessler's demands for eventual intelligence extraction. But Kessler's agreement came with conditions that complicated their plans in dangerous ways. An SS intelligence specialist would accompany the medical convoy, ostensibly to ensure Pavel's security during transport, but actually to begin preliminary questioning during the journey. The specialist's presence would make escape impossible using their original plan, requiring new arrangements that would be far more dangerous and much less certain of success. Wilhelm's modification of their escape plan reflected desperation disguised as tactical innovation. Instead of attempting to divert the medical convoy, they would wait until arrival at the rehabilitation facility before making their move. The center's rural location and minimal security presence would provide opportunities that were impossible during heavily guarded transport, but the delay also increased the likelihood that their deceptions would be discovered before escape became possible. The night before departure passed intense preparation for a journey that would either lead to freedom or expose them all to consequences that none wanted to contemplate. Wilhelm gathered supplies that might prove essential during escape attempts, while maintaining the appearance of routine administrative preparation for prisoner transfer. Katarina used the hours to prepare medical equipment that could support Pavel's care during flight, while providing tools that might prove useful for purposes beyond healing. Morphine could serve as both pain management and emergency sedation. Surgical instruments could function as weapons if circumstances demanded such desperate measures. Pavel's awareness of their plans was limited to information that would not compromise operations if he were captured and interrogated before escape became possible. He understood that transfer offered opportunities for freedom, but specific details remained restricted to Wilhelm and Katarina, whose coordination would determine whether their desperate gamble succeeded or failed catastrophically. The morning of departure dawned gray and cold, with autumn rain that turned Prague's cobblestones treacherous and reduced visibility in ways that could either help or hinder their plans, depending on circumstances they could not predict or control. The weather seemed to mirror the uncertainty that surrounded every aspect of their situation. The medical convoy assembled in the hospital courtyard with military precision that left no detail to chance. 3 vehicles would make the journey: an ambulance carrying Pavel and his medical attendants, a supply truck with equipment and personnel, and a command car containing the SS intelligence specialist, whose presence transformed routine medical transport into potential catastrophe. Wilhelm performed his role as administrative supervisor with practiced efficiency, checking documentation and coordinating logistics, while internally calculating distances, timing, and contingencies that might determine whether they lived or died in the hours ahead. Every gesture needed to appear routine while serving purposes that were anything but standard. Katarina took her position in the ambulance with medical supplies arranged to provide both legitimate care and concealed tools that might prove essential for survival. Her official role as medical attendant provided cover for presence that was actually motivated by love and loyalty rather than professional duty. The intelligence specialist introduced himself as Hauptsturmführer Ernst Weber, a career SS officer whose expertise involved extracting information from subjects who preferred to remain silent. His presence in the convoy was justified by Pavel's intelligence value, but his methods were legendary for their effectiveness and their brutality in equal measure. Weber's initial assessment of Pavel revealed professional interest that made Wilhelm's blood run cold. The intelligence specialist recognized signs that suggested Pavel's knowledge extended far beyond local resistance activities, indicating connections to Allied networks that would make him invaluable to German intelligence operations throughout occupied Europe. This recognition elevated Pavel from routine prisoner to strategic asset, whose capture could influence the course of resistance activities across the continent. Weber's enthusiasm for beginning interrogation procedures created pressure that threatened to expose the medical deceptions that had protected Pavel thus far. Wilhelm's response required balancing Weber's expectations with medical necessities that justified continued delays in questioning. The performance demanded confidence he did not feel while maintaining authority that was increasingly challenged by circumstances beyond his control. As the convoy departed Prague's familiar streets for countryside that offered both opportunity and danger, 3 lives hung in balance that could shift with any unexpected development. Wilhelm, Katarina, and Pavel were committed to a course of action that would either deliver them to freedom or destroy them, all in ways that would serve as warnings to others who might consider similar acts of rebellion against the machinery of occupation. The road ahead stretched through landscape that had witnessed centuries of conflict and survival, where human courage had been tested by circumstances that demanded choices between safety and conscience. Today, that ancient struggle would continue with stakes that felt both intensely personal and historically significant for everyone whose lives were being wagered on possibilities that seemed almost impossibly remote. The convoy wound through the Bohemian countryside like a mechanical serpent, its progress marked by the steady rhythm of engines that carried more than wounded soldiers and medical supplies. Each mile that passed beneath their wheels brought Wilhelm, Katarina, and Pavel closer to confrontation that would determine whether courage could triumph over the machinery of oppression, or whether their desperate gamble would end in the kind of brutal retribution that had silenced countless others who dared to choose humanity over ideology. Hauptsturmführer Weber rode in the command car with the patient attention of a predator who understood that the most valuable prey required careful handling. His questions about Pavel's condition came with increasing frequency as the journey progressed, each inquiry probing for weaknesses in the medical narrative that Wilhelm and Katarina had constructed with such desperate precision. Weber's experience with interrogation had taught him to recognize deception in its earliest stages, making him dangerous in ways that went far beyond his official authority. Inside the ambulance, Katarina monitored Pavel's vital signs with professional competence, while privately calculating how much longer their deceptions could withstand scrutiny from someone trained to detect exactly the kind of lies they were telling. Pavel's recovery was proceeding faster than their fabricated medical records suggested, his natural resilience overcoming surgical trauma in ways that contradicted the narrative about complications requiring specialized care. The sedatives Katarina had been administering to maintain Pavel's apparent weakness were becoming harder to justify as medical necessity. Weber's medical knowledge was limited, but sufficient to recognize when patient conditions didn't align with prescribed treatments. Each dose carried the risk of exposure while providing protection that was essential for maintaining their cover. Wilhelm rode in the supply truck, officially supervising equipment transport while actually preparing for contingencies that grew more likely with each passing hour. His administrative access had allowed him to include items that weren't listed on official inventories, additional medical supplies, civilian clothing, and documents that might prove essential if their planned escape required improvisation under pressure. The rehabilitation facility where they were supposedly headed was still hours away, located in countryside that offered both isolation from SS headquarters and opportunities for escape that simply didn't exist in heavily patrolled urban areas. But reaching that facility required surviving Weber's growing suspicions about discrepancies between Pavel's apparent condition and his intelligence value. The first crisis came when Weber demanded to examine Pavel personally, claiming that preliminary assessment was necessary for planning effective interrogation procedures. His request was militarily reasonable and professionally justified, making it impossible for Wilhelm to refuse without arousing the exact suspicions they had been working to avoid. Katarina's response to this development revealed the kind of quick thinking that had made her invaluable to the resistance medical network. She explained that Pavel's condition included neurological symptoms that made stimulation potentially dangerous, that examination by unfamiliar personnel could trigger seizures or other complications that would compromise his stability for transport. Her explanation was medically plausible and delivered with the professional authority that came from years of managing genuine medical crises. Weber accepted her assessment because it aligned with his own interests in preserving Pavel's condition for future interrogation. But his questions revealed growing skepticism about the convenient way medical necessities seemed to obstruct intelligence priorities. The convoy stopped for routine maintenance at a fuel depot that served German military traffic throughout the region. The halt provided opportunities for Weber to observe Pavel more carefully, while giving Wilhelm and Katarina precious minutes to coordinate responses to challenges they hadn't anticipated when planning their escape. Weber's examination of Pavel was cursory, but thorough enough to reveal inconsistencies between the patient's actual condition and the medical records that justified his transfer. Pavel's reflexes were stronger than expected for someone suffering from supposed neurological complications. His responses to questions were more coherent than brain trauma should have allowed. Most concerning, his resistance to examination suggested awareness and strength that contradicted the narrative about his weakened state. Katarina found herself providing increasingly complex explanations for discrepancies that Weber was documenting with the methodical precision of someone building a case for conclusions he was already reaching. The neurological symptoms were intermittent, she claimed. The apparent improvements were temporary fluctuations that preceded serious relapses. The patient's resistance was involuntary, a defensive response that actually indicated brain trauma rather than conscious defiance. Each explanation required medical knowledge that pushed the boundaries of Katarina's expertise, while demanding acting skills that felt foreign to someone whose professional identity was built on honest communication with patients and colleagues. The performance was exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, requiring constant vigilance to maintain deception that grew more complex with every question. Wilhelm watched these exchanges with growing dread, understanding that their carefully constructed plan was unraveling under scrutiny they had hoped to avoid until reaching the rehabilitation facility. Weber's suspicions were crystallizing into certainty that would soon demand explanations no amount of medical terminology could provide. The decision Wilhelm made as the convoy prepared to resume its journey reflected desperation disguised as tactical innovation. Instead of waiting for their original plan to collapse completely, he would accelerate their timeline by creating an emergency that justified immediate medical attention in a location that offered opportunities for escape. The emergency Wilhelm engineered was both simple and audacious. Pavel's condition would suddenly deteriorate during transport, requiring immediate medical intervention that couldn't wait for arrival at the rehabilitation facility. A rural clinic that Wilhelm had identified during his map studies would provide the necessary facilities while offering isolation that made escape attempts possible. Katarina's role in this improvised drama required her to simulate medical crisis with convincing urgency, while providing actual care that would support Pavel through whatever physical stress their escape attempt might demand. The performance needed to be dramatic enough to convince Weber that immediate action was necessary, but not so severe that it would result in Pavel's actual death. The medical emergency that unfolded in the ambulance 20 minutes after leaving the fuel depot was a masterpiece of controlled deception. Pavel began exhibiting symptoms that suggested serious complications, requiring immediate intervention seizures that were carefully choreographed, vital sign changes that reflected controlled medication, rather than actual crisis, neurological responses that indicated brain trauma demanding urgent care. Katarina's response was professionally perfect and personally terrifying, demonstrating medical expertise, while knowing that failure to maintain the deception would result in death for everyone involved. Her calls for immediate medical attention carried the authority of someone whose judgment had been proven reliable through months of successful treatment under impossible conditions. Weber's reaction revealed the limitations of intelligence training when confronted with medical emergencies that seemed to transcend political considerations. His expertise involved extracting information from conscious subjects, not managing life-threatening conditions that required immediate intervention. The sudden shift from interrogation, planning to medical crisis, created confusion that Wilhelm and Katarina were prepared to exploit. The rural clinic Wilhelm had identified was exactly the kind of facility that served isolated communities throughout occupied territories, minimally staffed, poorly equipped, but adequate for basic medical procedures that couldn't wait for transport to larger hospitals. More importantly, it was operated by a Czech doctor whose cooperation could be secured through appeals to medical ethics rather than political ideology. Dr. Václav Novotny had been practicing medicine in the Bohemian countryside for over 30 years, treating farmers and their families through conditions that ranged from routine illness to agricultural accidents that demanded surgical skill under primitive conditions. The occupation had complicated his work by limiting supplies and imposing regulations that prioritized German patients over Czech civilians, but it had not changed his fundamental commitment to healing anyone who needed his help. Novotny's response to their unexpected arrival was exactly what Wilhelm had hoped for, and exactly what Weber had not anticipated. The Czech doctor took immediate charge of Pavel's care with professional competence that brooked no interference from non-medical personnel, regardless of their rank or authority. His clinic became a sanctuary where medical necessity temporarily superseded political considerations. Weber found himself excluded from examination procedures that Novotny declared too delicate for observation by untrained personnel. The intelligence specialists' protests about security requirements and prisoner supervision were met with professional indifference that made clear medical priorities would determine what happened within the clinic's walls. Wilhelm positioned himself as liaison between medical and military requirements, translating Novotny's medical decisions into language that satisfied Weber's expectations, while ensuring that the Czech doctor understood the stakes involved for everyone present. The balance was delicate, requiring diplomatic skills that Wilhelm was developing under pressure that allowed no margin for error. Katarina worked alongside Novotny with the seamless efficiency of medical professionals who understood their craft well enough to communicate through gesture and intuition when words weren't sufficient. Their collaboration provided cover for preparations that had nothing to do with treating Pavel's fabricated medical emergency, and everything to do with creating opportunities for escape that might not come again. The clinic's rural location offered possibilities that hadn't existed during convoy transport or hospital confinement. Forest began just beyond the building's walls, providing concealment that could hide fugitives from pursuit for hours or days, depending on weather conditions and search procedures. Agricultural roads offered multiple routes away from the clinic, creating options that could confuse tracking efforts while leading towards safe houses that remained unknown to German intelligence. But escape required timing that balanced medical necessity against security concerns, creating windows of opportunity that would be measured in minutes rather than hours. Weber's patience was limited, and his growing suspicion about the convenient way medical emergencies seemed to obstruct intelligence priorities was approaching levels that would demand explanations no amount of improvisation could provide. The moment that would determine their fate came as afternoon shadows lengthened across the clinic's modest grounds. Pavel's condition had supposedly stabilized enough to allow resumed transport, but Novotny declared that nighttime travel posed unacceptable risks for someone in his fragile state. Medical ethics demanded overnight observation, before any movement could be considered. Weber's response to this development revealed the fundamental conflict between intelligence priorities and medical judgment that had been building throughout their journey. His demands for immediate prisoner transfer clashed with professional medical opinion that could not be overruled without exposing the entire operation as something other than routine medical transport. Wilhelm found himself mediating between competing authorities while privately calculating whether they had enough time to implement escape plans that depended on darkness and confusion for success. The clinic would provide sanctuary for only a few more hours before Weber's suspicions crystallized into actions that would make escape impossible. Katarina used the delay to prepare Pavel for physical demands that their escape attempt would require, administering medications that would enhance his strength and alertness, while maintaining the appearance of continued medical treatment. Her preparations needed to appear routine, while actually preparing for activities that would test Pavel's recovery against challenges that proper medical care would never recommend. As evening approached, 3 lives hung in balance that could shift with Weber's next decision or Novotny's next medical assessment. The rural clinic had become a stage where courage would confront authority, where individual conscience would challenge institutional power, where love would either triumph over ideology or be crushed beneath the machinery of occupation that had already consumed so many other dreams of freedom and human connection. The night ahead would determine whether Wilhelm's choice to see humanity instead of uniform had doomed them all, or whether Katarina's dedication to healing could extend to mending a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart through hatred and violence that served no purpose beyond the perpetuation of suffering. The story of Katarina and Wilhelm reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, individual choices can illuminate paths toward redemption that seem impossible in the moment. Their encounter in that Prague safe house wasn't just about one nurse saving one SS officer's conscience, or one man choosing to protect those he should have arrested. It was about the fundamental truth that love recognizes no uniforms, no flags, no artificial boundaries that politics tries to carve between human hearts. What happened to them that October night in 1942 proves that the most powerful act of resistance isn't always violent rebellion, but the quiet courage to see another person's humanity when the entire world demands you see only an enemy. Katarina's hands didn't just save Pavel's life in that candle-lit room. They saved Wilhelm's soul, and in doing so, reminded us all that healing can transcend every ideology that tries to divide us. Their story echoes across the decades as a testament to the choices we all face when conscience collides with convenience, when love challenges loyalty, when the price of maintaining our humanity seems almost too high to pay. In a world that still struggles with division and hatred, Katarina and Wilhelm's impossible connection reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when one heart chooses to trust another, despite every reason to turn away.